listening to Law, Life, and Culture with Betsy Kim on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Thank you, Harry Droz and Paul Bass. I'm Betsy Kim, and welcome to Law, Life, and Culture. I'm delighted to be joined by immigration attorney Megan LaFountain, the past chair of Connecticut AILA, that's it. American Immigration Lawyers Association, now treasurer of the Middlesex County Bar Association. She runs her private practice, LaFountain Immigration Law, out of Middleton, Connecticut. Dr. Elizabeth Stringer is a graduate of Yale University, yay, New Haven, and she's a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. She runs her private practice out of New York City. A lawyer and a shrink, exactly what we need to talk about immigration 2025. Welcome to our program, Dr. Stringer and Counselor LaFountain.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Betsy. It's so nice to be here.
Well, Donald Trump has said with the new administration on day one, cracking down on immigration is a top priority. I sensed immigration and the many subtexts of what it involves, including race, xenophobia, the economy, feelings of security, struggling to belong, and how people define American culture were determining factors of this last election. I'm going to ask my two guests what role you felt immigration played in the election of Donald Trump and or how this has affected the work you do. Let's start with our resident immigration lawyer, Counselor LaFountain.
Sadly, like you said, Betsy, I think there was a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric, a lot of racist rhetoric, and just a lot of hatred that was being spewed throughout the 2024 election campaign by Donald Trump, by the Republicans running in general, and also just because immigration is a hot topic by people throughout the country, even if they weren't necessarily politically motivated or politically involved. We certainly started to see some really bad things come up in society. And as a result, I do think it impacted the results of the election. I think that throughout history, we've seen fear and hatred and otherization, looking at people as different from us, as something that sometimes motivates people to vote or to act in certain ways. And I think we saw that at least in part with the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. And I think what we're going to see going forward is currently unpredictable. I certainly can speak as to what Donald Trump did the first time he was in office and some of the things he's talked about, what he wants to do in 2025 and going forward. But as of right now, we still don't have anything concrete to tell us what exactly will happen once he becomes president.
How about the psychology of this all? What have you seen in your practice, Dr. Stringer?
Well, I have a sort of skewed sample because I live and work in one of the most liberal zip codes in the country. So I would say that in terms of clinical repercussions, most people were distressed and upset. It ran the gamut from somebody who reported crying all day. And I have a colleague who said she had the same experience with one of her patients. To people kind of mentioning the election and then kind of moving on. And mentioning distress at the election. So there was nobody in my practice that was going, woohoo, this is great. There were people there was one person I can think of in particular who was surrounded by people who were in his family who were very distressed, but wanted to be able to see the point of view of the people who voted for Trump. I don't know how much the immigration issue was the direct cause of it, but I think people recognize a sort of disappointment in the ideals of the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. But I have to be honest, the visuals on the news on election day, there was a caravan of 2,000 migrants heading toward the border of Mexico and the US. And on the news, we were hearing that this immigration crisis would cost New York $12 billion. That was recently scaled down to 10 billion over 3 years. And that wasn't really great news. I didn't want to see the extreme measures Trump was proposing or threatening, but I did feel, okay, something needs to be done. We need to welcome people with immigration, but in an orderly manner. Is that what you achieve through immigration law, Megan? And from an immigration lawyer's perspective, can you respond to my comments?
So ideally, immigration law is the process where we can do this in an orderly and dignified manner. Some of our immigration laws have been around for a very long time and are a little bit outdated. They don't necessarily address the realities of the world as it is right now, or the realities of what's here, even within the United States. So, looking at our system, we had a lot of major changes post World War II. It was the real start of the asylum and refugee system, where people can come to the US and live a safer life than wherever it is that they're from. It was also the start of the system that we know today with family based immigration and employment based immigration. I primarily, just to throw it out there, do family based and removal defense and affirmative asylum applications. I don't do employment based immigration, but knowing other attorneys who do, even the employment based system, something that we would think we could all agree on, getting better, better and more doctors, farm workers, engineers, specialists of all kinds here into the US and really getting the advantage of all of the education and all of the experience of immigrants around the world. Even that system is extremely outdated and doesn't take into account how many people are actually trying to process their cases right now. So, yes, ideally, immigration law is the way we can do this all orderly and avoid, hopefully, the caravans of people coming into the country that are portrayed on the media. But realistically, it's not something that actually is able to address the issues right now. And even just looking at the caravans of individuals, why is it that they're coming here? A lot of times people say, well, if they just get in line, then they're able to process it correctly. But for so many people, there is no line, there is no process. In order to apply for asylum, for example, you have to be physically in the United States. But what happens if you can't get a visa and your life is in danger in your country? Your only choice is to try to cross the border illegally. So for many people, that is truly the only way.
Now, Elizabeth, I thought about this a lot, this general question as to why are people mean and selfish? I mean, in this context, what are the limitations of kindness and compassion? Does kindness stop at some point for everyone, as we can only be as nice as each of us individually feel we can afford to be?
There's something to that. I guess I'd frame it a little bit differently. I mean, putting aside people who have had various difficulties in life, that their general MO is to be mean. In terms of self-interest, there's always a conflict between self-interest and other interest. And there are times when someone else's self-interest oversteps ours, that it is adaptive, quote unquote, and useful to be able to set limits and not over sacrifice. That being said, where you draw that line is so different for so many different people. There is also a phenomenon that they call compassion fatigue, which is something that we therapists can be familiar with sometimes, that if you get constantly overloaded with a lot of things, and I think medical people probably experienced it a lot during the pandemic, and that can inure people. But I think the issue is, where do you draw the line between being compassionate in terms of someone else's self-interest and where you're protecting your own?
Well, Donald Trump kept promising to be tougher on immigration in his second term. In his first term, he focused on stricter border and port of entry policies, whereas this time around, he also campaigned and post-election confirmed plans to use the military to more aggressively round up and deport undocumented people. Megan, do you envision this massive deportation ahead, and has it affected how immigration lawyers are advising immigration clients?
I certainly fear that that massive deportation could come into reality. And I think it is absolutely affecting our clients. I opened my office at 9 in the morning, and on the day after Election Day, I had the first call of a client who was crying in tears the entire phone call by 9:15, fearing that he would be deported. And I think that is sadly something that is front and center in a lot of hearts and minds of immigrants and immigrant families around the country. How Donald Trump will do it, I have no idea, but certainly it's something that we need to be aware of. And as immigration attorneys, we are advising our clients to make sure that they have plans in place for what should happen if they do get arrested by immigration. We did this a lot during Trump's first term as well. Family preparedness plans. In a case where perhaps a parent is undocumented and the children are US citizens, make
Oh, I think you're
I'm
saying,
sorry, I was muted that entire time.
no, you weren't. You just proceed. You
No?
were, yeah, no. We got to the point where you said to have a plan in place that happened the
Oh,
first time around. And so if you'd like to
okay,
continue.
good.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what I did to mute myself, so I apologize. Anyway, so we've been talking about having plans in place, particularly if there are young children or children of any age or individuals of any age who need the care of an immigrant, to make sure that there is a plan, a guardian in place to take over the care and control of those individuals. Perhaps if someone is a business owner, what can be put in place to continue to have that business run if the owner is deported or even just arrested by immigration? Because the reality is the deportation process can take quite some time. And if someone is arrested by immigration, they could be jailed for weeks or months or perhaps even longer than that while waiting to get a decision from an immigration judge as to whether they have to leave the country or whether they're allowed to stay.
How has this threat of deportation affected immigration clients? Are they considering going into hiding now, or do they fear sending their children to school? And what advice for protection can you give such folks?
So I have had clients ask me if they should move or if they should try to hide somewhere. And the problem is if they're already in the immigration system, whether they're in immigration court or whether they've just filed something with the immigration office, there's a requirement that you keep the immigration system updated of your current address. And if you move and don't reveal that information to the immigration office or the immigration court, that could cause you problems down the road. In terms of people being afraid of sending their children to school, I haven't heard that yet, but certainly I imagine that that is a fear. And I do know of people who were arrested by waiting at the bus stop to drop off their kids or pick up their kids, and ICE just happened to come and get them during the first Trump administration. So I think it is something that could become a problem the second time around.
Elizabeth, what is the psychological toil of having such looming threats over your head if you are an undocumented person?
It's major. I mean, in terms of having an essential feeling of security, knowing that you could get kicked out at any moment is hugely undermining, and particularly given that most people don't come here lightly. They come because they're under some large duress wherever they came from. So it's like having a Damoclean sword over your head and generate a lot of anxiety and worry.
If such actions do occur, people are rounded up, incarcerated, separated from families, and deported. What is the psychological impact that would likely have on most people?
I'd say it's likely to be traumatic for most people. because usually they've undergone some kind of duress to get here in the first place. And the process of being sent back is usually not simple. And there are usually issues about whether parents and children are going to be kept together or separated. So I'd say, to put it shortly, it generally tends to be traumatic.
I recently read that New York Mayor Eric Adams is relocating 2,000 asylum seekers, or he's thinking about it, 500 families with children who are living in temporary shelters in Brooklyn at the Floyd Bennett Field, a former airplane runway. It's land leased to New York City by the federal government. And the fear is that now they are afraid that they're a huge sitting target for the next administration to round up, detain, incarcerate, and deport. Megan, are there legally any sanctuaries, such as houses of worship, or any areas or zones of legal protection that could apply? And what protections would be available through the rule of law or constitutional laws, for example, in your immigration lawyer's toolkit?
First thing that we have to keep in mind is whether someone is entitled to an actual removal hearing, which is a deportation court process in front of an immigration judge. Removal hearings in immigration court do have to take place under the way the current law is written. However, exceptions can be made for individuals who have been in the country for less than 2 years and are found within 100 miles of any sort of border, whether it's a land border or, in theory, even an airport, which certainly expands, if it's an international airport, a lot of the country to have this 100-mile border created. Now, in practice, typically we see that as applied to only individuals who are in the country 14 days or less within 100 miles of the Canadian border or the Mexican border. But if Donald Trump wants to, he could certainly expand that process and do expedited removal for anyone who's been in the U.S. unlawfully in the past, entered the U.S. unlawfully within the past 2 years, and is within 100 miles of any of those things that can be construed as an international border. If that's the case, then yes, I think there's a lot more people who can certainly have who certainly are right to be afraid of what might happen to them. But in terms of what can actually be done to protect them, that's also another question. So right now we do have sanctuary cities. We have policies in place, whether it's the city itself, whether it's a town, a university, a school, a hospital, policies that are followed where if these locations are seen as sanctuaries, that ICE cannot come in to arrest somebody. But Donald Trump has also spoken a lot about doing away with that, perhaps threatening to remove funding from states or from localities that do have offered or have offered sanctuary to immigrants. So it is something that right now we do have in place, but something that certainly could change going forward.
Well, Dr. Stringer, expanding beyond undocumented migrants, learning about the psychological impacts, what does this have on people who are acquaintances of people held into detention, immigration hearings, and ultimately deported, and also even the nation as a whole, even if you don't personally know anyone deported, just reading about it in the news and knowing this is going on, does this cause stress for the country as a whole?
Well, I think it obviously depends on the person, but I would say yes. I mean, I think there are plenty of people who will, kind of put blinders on and it won't necessarily affect them. But I mean, it's so contradictory to the saying that's on the Statue of Liberty. I think, I think a lot of people do feel as though it betrays our values. And I mean, it is a problem to have a lot of people coming in at once, but we need to figure out a way to manage that.
So, Councillor LaFountain, does anyone legally benefit from these measures? For example, is there an impact on visa availabilities for those legally waiting in line, as you often hear that as an argument? And with visa backlogs, people waiting to enter the country, could people in such situations benefit by visa numbers or impacted in any beneficial way? Or is this just a lose-lose situation for immigrants in general as it flames greater anti-immigrant sentiments?
So the visa numbers that you're talking about are numbers that are set by by policy and have been set for years for family-based and employment-based immigration. And those are based on an annual limit. So, for example, if someone is trying to get a green card based on their job, there's a certain number that can be processed every single year. Now, how many people or how long that backlog is does not get affected by how many people are crossing the border illegally, because that number that exists, the X number of thousand that can be issued every year, does not change based on how many people are coming into the country. I do think that by having more people here, certainly it makes the individual immigration offices operate a little more slowly, just because there's more things to process. So if you imagine whatever type of work that you're doing, you have 10 times as many cases you have to get through. It's going to take you longer to do than what you had the year before if you had 10 times fewer. So in that situation, I think it can take longer for cases to be adjudicated. But in terms of people who are just held up by a visa backlog, that is not being impacted by the people who are crossing the border.
You're listening to WNHH 103.5 FM in New Haven, Connecticut. We're discussing Immigration 2025 with clinical psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Stringer and Connecticut-based immigration lawyer Megan LaFountain. Now, Dr. Stringer, do the MAGA supporters, the Build a Wall, America First people, derive a psychological benefit from this Schadenfreude extreme? Or with even people reveling in other people's misery, what long-term psychological impacts does it have on celebrants witnessing this type of deportation?
I mean, obviously, it depends on their orientation in the first place. If it's people who feel threatened by the change in the demographics of the country, there may be some relief in seeing this happening. But for most people, especially if the people who are getting deported have become part of the community, that's distressing.
So where do you think this individualized, personalized fear of the other, or xenophobia, or racism, frankly, comes from?
That is a super complicated question. I'll try to give one of several simplified answers. One, Jane Goodall was interviewed by Fareed Zakaria about chimpanzees, and she talked about how if someone from another tribe of chimpanzees came into the other tribe, then the first tribe would try to kill the people who came in. And obviously, we're not genetically that far from chimpanzees. So that's one possibility. I think during times of stress, when there's a lot of uncertainty and change, people revert to more simplified ways of looking at the world. The sort of technical term is splitting, looking at things in an either or kind of way. And I think when there is a lot of stress and confusion, people can revert to that. And so that leads to a lot more of quote unquote othering. And certainly we're in a time of a lot of change and transition, especially post-pandemic. So I think that's another contributor.
The statistics are that immigrants actually commit far fewer and at a far lower percentage of crimes, less than half the rate of native-born U.S. citizens, according to the Justice Department. So what is a way to unwind some of this fear and hatred that seems to have taken over or loomed larger in recent times?
I'm reminded of the studies that showed that when people work together, they're more likely to be welcoming to each other. So I think when communities are more integrated with each other and are more familiar with each other, thus they're less likely to do that kind of othering. But we know that experiments along those lines with, say, busing in the 60s can be tricky territory sometimes. But as a general principle, the more people are sort of have more to do with each other, and that can help. Although I also think of people I know that grew up in neighborhoods where there were sort of separate fiefdoms of different ethnicities, and so it doesn't always work that way. That there can be kind of rivalry. So you do still need to do something to make sure that people are actually participating with each other.
So do you think that means more social programming in the United States?
It's a good question. I think I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, I guess what I'm thinking is that I know, for instance, in schools, they when there are different communities, I think the teachers and the administration do have ways of trying to get the different groups to participate with each other and not separate into separate camps.
So I want to double back with the Floyd Bennett field and the statistic of the 210,000 undocumented migrants who came to New York since the spring of 2022. I think what's important is that the news or statistics don't really show some of the true stories of what these actual people go through, which both of you referenced in terms of harrowing conditions, escaping terrifying situations. For example, in Afghanistan, which I'm familiar with my pro bono immigration work, then they go through the jungles in South America just to get to the American border. So, Councillor LaFountain, do people legally still have a right to go to the border and with Customs Border Patrol ask to turn themselves in to plead for asylum? Or what's the latest in law and procedures now, and how will that likely change post-January 20th?
That right still does exist, but it has been made more difficult to access. So, for example, there was a CBP1 process that started, and that was a way that people could make appointments to actually access the Border Patrol agents at the border and be able to seek asylum at the border. So it sounds like a great idea. You make an appointment on your phone, you schedule it, you go to the border on that day and present yourself. The problem is that the app itself had a lot of glitches. The first thing is it requires a phone. It requires an internet connection. And you referenced people crossing through the jungles and people crossing through really harrowing situations. They might not have a phone anymore. The second thing is it requires good lighting and the ability for the camera on the phone to actually take a picture. And sadly, there are a lot of examples of people who had darker complexions whose pictures were not accepted by the app, and they were told that they were not able to make the appointment. And then the third thing was that just like anything that requires an appointment, sometimes there's no appointments available. The next appointment could be months away, or you might have to check back every single day to see if there's even a slot months from now, which means that people were waiting in towns and villages in Mexico that they didn't know anyone, they didn't speak the language, and they were just waiting and waiting to try to get that appointment so they could actually go to the border and ask for asylum.
Can you break down legally why it's so hard to get asylum?
Absolutely. So asylum has a number of elements. The first thing is you have to have either experienced past persecution in your country, or you have to have a well-founded fear of future persecution in your country. That persecution has to be connected to something specific about you. Persecution is not just something dangerous in your community. In other words, if the three of us went and lived somewhere and we all three would be in danger, no matter what we did, who we are, what we look like, then that's not persecution. That's just violence and danger in the area. So persecution has to be specific to the individual and has to be based on their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group. So think back to the origins of the asylum system and what happened during World War II, where the Nazis persecuted people because of their religion, or because they spoke out against the Nazis. So that could also be a political opinion, and persecuted these individuals. That's what we're looking for today. So if I went back to Nazi Germany and I did not speak out against the Nazis, and I am not Jewish, and I am not any one of the other groups that the Nazis were persecuting, then I could live in Germany or in the Nazi controlled areas without having to fear harm for myself. But if I went back and I was Jewish, or if I was outspoken and was trying to save the Jews, or if I was part of one of the other groups that the Nazis were targeting, then my life would be in danger every single day. And that's what we're looking at when we're trying to get someone to apply for asylum and get approved for asylum here in the US now. You also have to apply within 1 year of arriving into the US, which a lot of people don't know. They might get here, they might not speak the language, they might have limited resources, they might not know any attorneys, and they have no idea that this process is something they have to do immediately. They also might be experiencing the after effects of all the trauma they've gone through, and they might not be able to recount in great detail everything that they've experienced, and so they end up delaying the application because of that. And all of these things can result in people not being qualified for asylum.
Well, psychologically, Dr. Stringer, I know you talked about this a little at the beginning of the program, but delving a little bit more, what kind of toll, including physical effects, is the Trump election having on people? Asking for a friend, do you have advice, say, for stress eating, feeling malaise, a sense of uncertainty or lack of well-being, or feeling shaken that this election was an endorsement or approval of what people feel they, for so many years, were taught were not the values or behaviors that should be rewarded?
It's a tricky issue. I think it's funny, I was at a discussion at dinner the other night, and somebody used the term internal migration, and they were using it psychologically, and I didn't know if they had made it up or they heard it somewhere, because I guess internal migration usually refers to moving somewhere else in the country. But I think what they meant was people sort of going inward to things like gardening and basically things you can control. It's tricky though. I mean, I remember feeling a bit of that after 9/11, but you don't necessarily want people going to the extent of, I remember reading about a guy during the French Revolution. There was a gardener who kept a diary, and it was right when the French Revolution was going on outside his door. There was no reference to it whatsoever. So he clearly went so internal that outside circumstances weren't affecting him at all. I mean, it's a tricky balance to pull off. I mean, I think one thing that's helpful is to keep in mind that almost half the country didn't vote for this. I think that's one ingredient in there. I think the other ingredient is that I think there are so many complicated issues about why people did vote for Trump that I think it is important to try to wrap our minds around that. Not the part that betrays our values, but the parts that have to do with the other person having a sense of threat. I think, for instance, it's possible that the price of eggs and milk had as much influence as anything. And that there's an emotional response that the rational information about the fact that inflation was better doesn't affect that. If they're checking out at the counter and they're paying extra money for milk and eggs, that's going to have an effect. So it's a complicated issue.
Certainly. What about the psychological impacts for those who supported the outcome of this election?
Yeah. I suspect there's relief. I think there are, for some of the people who voted for him, I think they thought that things had gone too far in terms of, quote unquote, the liberal woke agenda. I think it's tricky because things like trans rights didn't appeal to a good chunk of people. And I think there are groups of the country that have, quote unquote, more traditional values that felt like supposedly the woke left had gotten too much power. So I think, again, lots of ingredients in there, but those are a couple of them.
Do you think that psychologically this is going to embolden any behavior that's less than desirable?
It's a really good question. I don't know. I worry about it. I worry about the fact that Trump said he'd be dictator for a day, and I hope that it's not more than that. I mean, one possible silver lining is that if he had not won, there might be a lot more violence a la January 6th that could have taken place. Not that that's a justification, but I don't know is the answer.
Now, Councilor LaFountain, you also addressed this a bit at the top of the hour, but I want to go back and delve into this a little bit more as well. You have a thriving immigration legal practice. How will this next administration impact other areas of immigration law? Do you anticipate it will make all areas in immigration more difficult? International adoptions, travel, business, even family law? Why or why not?
I do think this will likely impact everything across the board with immigration. So in the first Trump administration, we saw increased scrutiny on family-based cases. So for example, if an American citizen married a foreigner, those cases got a lot more scrutiny than they do now and than they did prior to the Trump administration. If someone was trying to process an application based on their job, that got more scrutiny and a lot of additional requests for evidence were issued. A lot more things had something that's called a notice of intent to deny, which means that immigration wanted to deny the application. And a lot more hurdles were put in place, even as stupid as just every single blank on a form. So the way the application works is it's a PDF style form. There's boxes that obviously don't apply. So for example, if I don't have a middle name, what would I put in the box that asks for my middle name? In theory, you would think I could simply put absolutely nothing and just leave it blank. But the Trump administration started rejecting applications that did not have something written in every single box. So there had to be a not applicable or an NA in every box that did not apply. And that alone is just something that sounds so ridiculous, but was something that was happening under the Trump administration.
I recall that. I firmly believe a country is made up of individuals, our individual identities, values, and psychologies that collectively make up our national character. So, Dr. Stringer, how do we address what feels irretrievably broken, these gulfs of knowledge of what and how people seem to see the world in our country. And how do you even begin to communicate with someone whose views are so different and frankly, you feel just do not listen?
It's a really good question. Um, and again, a complicated one. I even know family members who just don't communicate about it. Yeah, people go to their corners. I mean, I think that is part of the problem, is that we have gotten more polarized. I think it used to be easier when there were family members that had different political points of view. It wasn't so polarized that they could not speak to each other at all. Whereas things have gotten particularly heated. I think we have to, once people have gotten past the sadness, the anger, and the disappointment in the election for people who are on the side that didn't vote for him, I think we do need to do our best to try to understand where the other side's coming from, and what is motivating them and what is upsetting them. Because without that, we're not going to be able to find some kind of place to meet.
So legally, Councilor LaFountain, can what Dr. Stringer has been talking about be accomplished or impacted or shaped through immigration laws and policies in any way?
I do think so. In fact, that last thing about being able to talk to people who disagree with you, to talk to the other side, I mean, that's what we need to do to pass any sort of law here in the
Yes.
United States.
Yes.
No matter what we do, there's always going to be people who have different views.
Yep.
And we need to be willing to come to the table and talk about them. And we all need to be willing to sometimes give something up in order to achieve a tiny step of progress. So whether it's in your personal life with family members who don't see eye to eye with you on immigration or the president or other issues, it's the same in Congress. It's the same in the administration. It's the same that we have to do going forward.
What's the next step you think towards effective advocacy that's first on your list of what you feel immigration lawyers and their allies should do?
A difficult question to answer because on a good day, I would say we do drastically need immigration reform. And I'm not talking about looking at Trump coming into office and what will he do. I'm talking about the system just as it is. So over 10 years ago, we were really, really close to actually making some progress on reform, and it fell through. And every time since then that we've come nowhere even near as close as then, but every step we make, we just don't seem to get there. So whether it's increasing visa numbers, so that way people who are waiting in a backlog that could take 10 years or more can actually process their cases more quickly, whether it's hiring more employees, whether it's judges, government attorneys, people who work at the immigration office, so that way cases can be processed more efficiently and go through the system faster. All of that's really important and has nothing to do with what's right and what's wrong about immigration. It just simply gets things done in a way that we all want to see. We don't want people to be waiting for 10 years to be able to process something.
So how do you make the world just a little bit better, one client at a time, or in your corner of the world?
I think you would have to ask my clients because sadly, I have a lot of conversations these days where I'm definitely not making their world any better. I just spoke with someone today and said, I'm sorry, I don't think it's a good idea for you to move forward with your case. I think it's too risky. I think we need to wait to see what Donald Trump will do before actually making a decision as to whether you should proceed. I have a lot of asylum applicants, like I mentioned before, and a lot of them have had extreme abuse by their partners, whether it's a spouse or just a domestic partner. And during the first Trump administration, that was something that he actually abolished. He got rid of the ability for people to get asylum on that ground. And I had cases where women had had extreme domestic violence and sexual abuse, And I had to tell them, no, you're probably going to lose if this is heard under the Trump administration. And sadly, it's another conversation that I've had to have since the election to warn clients that what may have been a strong case will not be a strong case anymore. So I do my best for every single client and I advocate for them. And for some clients, I am able to get them status. I am able to get them onto their next step. The client I'm meeting with right after this for filing his citizenship application. So he got asylum a number of years ago with his mom. And he's now just actually turning 18. So we can file his application, which is great for him. So yeah, it really does depend on the individual client.
So, Dr. Stringer, I've heard some pro-Trump voters felt privileged, affluent, liberal elites were condescending and telling them morally what and how to think. And so there was a backlash and they rebelled. How do you psychologically influence people to be perhaps more open-minded and inclusive, but do it in an effective way where such a response isn't triggered?
Well, what comes to mind are some of the studies I think they did in the 60s that one of the biggest things that changes people's minds in terms of prejudice and that sort of thing is working together. And figuring out some forms of projects and work where people can participate with each other. And there seems to be something about that that's a humanizing and a de-othering phenomenon.
Short of a program, but just in people's individual lives, perhaps, where the dynamics of who they're associating with isn't particularly going to change, what can be steps toward, if not national healing, but education, emotional or psychological, one person, one friend, or one coworker at a time? Or do you just have to withdraw from certain people for your own sanity?
I don't know. I guess it depends on how combative they are in their opinions. I mean, I'm not sure. I think if people get too polarized in their opinions and they're not actually listening to each other, I'm not sure there's a value in staying engaged. I guess if you want to engage them, I guess the issue is trying to figure out if there's a way to listen to where they're coming from without getting triggered yourself and then it leading to some kind of embattled conversation that gets nobody anywhere. Yeah.
Your perspective, how do you, or what do you recommend for clients psychologically make the world a better place, just starting in their own corner of the world?
It's a good question. I mean, it's funny. I heard somebody on the radio talking about what you can do politically if you're not one of the people who supported Trump. And she was recommending do anything, basically taking action. And it almost doesn't matter, but taking action in some corner of the world that you can have an effect on. And I remember, I think it's William Carlos Williams maybe said, brighten the corner where you are. I mean, and I think doing something that feels like you're enacting some influence, even if it's in a small corner, can help the sense of helplessness that I think can come up in other situations, in this kind of situation.
So for my very last question, I wanted to ask each of you for any of your final thoughts that you would really want our listeners today to take away with them. So Councillor LaFountain, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. So I think it's important that we go into 2025 knowing that things will be a challenge on the immigration front, on every front, if you are not a Trump supporter. Or even if you were, and perhaps you supported Donald Trump for just a very, very small reason.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about it a little bit, but the price of eggs and the price of milk is truly something that made people vote for Donald Trump.
Agree.
And they may not like him for any other reason, but if they are struggling financially, then that's what they're looking for. So we have to keep that in mind. It is not necessarily black and white that someone who voted for Donald Trump is going to oppose absolutely everything that you think is right in the world. So try to come to terms with them where you do agree and try to have conversations where you don't and still understand where they're coming from, and do that on the immigration front as well. So if you're looking to help immigrants, certainly try to get involved in your community. I'm sure there will be a lot of efforts, just like there were last time, to try to help support the immigrants in our community. Try to talk to people who don't see things the way you do. Try to educate them about the value of immigrants and why immigrants come here. So again, just because we see images of caravans approaching the border, it doesn't mean that they're all bad. It doesn't mean that they're all trying to break the law. Talk to them about what it truly means and why it is that people need to come here for a better life and what we can do to try to make their lives better.
And Dr. Stringer, your final thoughts?
I 100% agree with everything she just said. And I think people tend to get more polarized in a more complicated world. And so to try not to join that polarization yourself, and do whatever you can, even when you don't agree with the other point of view, to at least try to see it. And I also think that feeling threatened by quote unquote otherness is old, and I think we see it with the chimpanzees. So I think it can be easy for people to move into that viewpoint and forget about the parts that are really not so other.
Well, thank you very much, Attorney Megan LaFountain and psychoanalyst Elizabeth Stringer, for joining us. I think we're out of time now, but I'm Betsy Kim on WNHH 103.5 FM's Law, Life, and Culture.
Thank you so much, Betsy. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
You're listening to Law, Life, and Culture with Betsy Kim on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.